Christianity did not emerge in a vacuum. It took root in a world shaped by pagan religion, competing philosophies, and deeply entrenched cultural traditions. And yet, the early Christians didn't simply defend themselves against criticism, they made a positive and persuasive case for the truth of the faith. So, how did the early Christians make that case? In this interview, Dr. Chad Kendall joins me to unpack protreptic apologetics, an ancient method of persuasion used by the Church Fathers, and why it still matters today. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Javier Perdomo. This channel is a place where we like to do theology videos, church history videos, and Reformation apologetics videos, although we also do general Christian apologetics videos. And today, I think we'll have a little bit of each of those categories kind of threaded together. So with us, we have my guest, Dr. Chad Kendall. Dr. Kendall earned his MDiv as well as his PhD in missiology at Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne. He currently serves as Associate Professor of Theology, as well as Associate Vice President for Church Relations and Mission at Concordia University, Chicago. Prior to coming to Concordia, Chicago, Dr. Kendall has served as pastor of churches across Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa for over 2 decades. He's also been the keynote speaker, I believe, talking about this exact same topic at conferences before. How are you doing today, Dr. Kendall?
I am doing great. Thank you. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing pretty well. I've been excited. I'm looking forward to this. Like I said earlier, for anyone that's not familiar with this topic in particular, I'm not sure what I'll put as the title, but we're basically going to be talking about an ancient form of apologetics, a very patristic form of apologetics. Patristic there, speaking about the church fathers, right? These early Christians, with a particular sort of emphasis, I guess, on Clement of Alexandria. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, and so it'll be cool because, again, for anyone that's not familiar with the history, I mean, there's a reason why, right? Christianity took over the world. Now, obviously, there's a lot of different things that go into that when it comes to, the Roman Empire and all these different things, right? A lot of moving pieces, but a
Mhm.
large part of that does, in fact, have to do with the apologetics efforts of the earliest Christians.
Mhm.
Apologetics here simply referring to speaking in defense of something. In this particular case, in defense of the Christian faith. And I think they had a very unique way of doing this that maybe we've lost a little bit sight of today. And I think there's some lessons there that we might be able to pick up from our forefathers on how we can reach the unchurched today. So, with that, I'm going to go ahead and put up your presentation, brother, let you get to it. And then once we're done with your presentation, we will go ahead and have some follow up questions.
Okay, thank you, Javier. So I'm going to talk today about an ancient form of apologetics. And, when we often talk about apologetics in the church, we think about evidential apologetics. And there is a place for that. It can be very useful, but this is a paradigm shift, what I'm going to talk about today. It's it's a form of dialogue that you may listen to this and say, I've read books that talk about this, but it's just not called what I'm going to call it. Or you may say, I have done bits of this in my work as well, but I didn't know that it was a thing, that it had a name and that there was a construction to it. Um, I have given this presentation, which you'll see at the bottom of this opening slide. I did this at the English District Convention in 2025 and do it often around the nation. And it's a great opportunity to talk about three things that I love. The first thing that I love is the Greek New Testament. It is something that I've poured my life into as a study, learning the Koine Greek language. And then another piece that I love is the early church fathers, or patristics. And then there is a third piece to this, which is missiology. It's missiological dialogue, talking with people outside the church, people that have very different philosophies of life. And this particular approach merges the three very nicely. And it was one of those things that just appealed to me, and it's just become my real academic work and thrust in my ecclesiastical and academic life. And what this is called is protreptics. And protreptics is a form of dialogue that has three things in mind. So here's your Greek, okay? So for protreptic dialogue to take place, you need the logos or the word. So that'd be the message, the speech, the content. The second thing would be pathos, which would be the passion or the emotive response, or, it is how the audience responds to what they hear. So it's not just pure emotionalism where, we try to work people up into an emotional state so that they believe, but rather it is the logos or the word, the message, the speech, the content that turns a person to embrace what they hear. And then the third piece is the ethos, which would be the moral conduct of the speaker. And it's not just pure moralism in, kind of a modern sense that we would, categorize it very narrowly, but it really is the life and breath of the speaker. It's how the person goes about himself, herself. It is about how we live and breathe. It's about the rhythm of our life and how the things that we believe impact the way we behave, the way we live, the way we do things. And protreptics itself it means to turn a person towards a new art of living. It's to turn somebody towards something. And where this differs from a lot of modern dialogue is that protreptics aims at the life of the person. It aims at the heart. It doesn't just aim at the intellect. A lot of our dialogue today will tend to just aim right at the intellect, and you're looking for purely rational positions and data. And this protreptics is quite a bit different from what we're used to. But this particular piece is really important. These three things: the logos, the pathos, and then the ethos. And when we think about patristics, protreptics was done in the early church. And there are different periods even within patristics. When we think about the early church and patristics, we think about the Nicene period. We think about when Constantine Christianizes the world, and you're looking at the early 300s AD, and he Christianizes the Roman Empire. Constantine does, and so then you start to see a shift in the church. You start to see a shift in the writings and in the dialogue, and you start to see more debate over Christian theology and what is a particular doctrine and things of that nature. And then you start to see heresies spring up as they are debating about Christ, the divinity of Christ or the humanity of Christ, depending on what side they were emphasizing. And you see then a real thrust. You get into Augustine, and you start seeing writings on Christian doctrine. He writes his wonderful writing De Doctrina Christiana. And we often think about the early church or patristics from a Nicene perspective. And there's protreptics at work within the Nicene period. It's a little more subtle, perhaps. But what I am going to talk about primarily in this presentation is the early apologists and what it was like to be a Christian apologist, a Christian theologian in the pre-Nicene period when things were a little bit different. So there were the early apologists, and here are a few examples that were written in those early periods pre-Nicaea. Ad Autolycum by Theophilus of Antioch, Oratio ad Graecus by Tatian, There's the Epistle to Diognetus, Ad Graecus, Cohortatio Ad Graecus, and then what I'm going to talk about is the Protrepticus by Clement of Alexandria. And, quite honestly, in these early days, the missionary purpose was the only one. This was missionary literature. It's important because it explains its limitations, and it is concerned solely with seeking to invite people into the dialogue. And, so often, like, these writings, to a large extent, were written in an effort for civic leaders and rulers to listen to the Christian message in order that it may become a legal religion, that it may become accepted in discourse. The appeal is to demonstrate that they're not rogue, but that they have legitimate arguments, and that they should be welcomed into the the civic and public discourse. And protreptics, my PhD dissertation is on Protreptics by Clement of Alexandria, and he has his own writing that is called Protreptic. It is usually in English titled Exhortation to the Greeks, but I would like to preface all of this by talking a little bit about Clement and his context. So,
Hey everyone, quick pause here. If you're enjoying this discussion and finding it helpful, it would really help the channel if you would share the video with your friends, hit the like button, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. And if you appreciate the sort of in-depth work we do around here on theology, church history, and apologetics, all from a reformational lens, I would highly encourage you to check out the description down below for ways in which you can help support this channel. Monthly supporters like you help make videos like this possible. Thank you so much. Let's get back to it.
Clement of Alexandria lived approximately 150 to 212 AD. And Clement was himself a man that had lived in Athens, perhaps raised in Athens. He was definitely raised in the Greek context. He does at one point end up in Alexandria, Egypt. And Alexandria, Egypt was a busy port city. It was right on the sea. And so, it was just as you would expect for, a busy port city. There were a lot of different kinds of people going through there. And as a result, there were a lot of different philosophies and a lot of different beliefs. There were, I would say, there were a lot of different cultures, and it was said of that particular city that there were 5 regional districts where people would live, and 3 of the regions, and this was kind of the irony, while it was a very syncretistic, variegated city, they lived in areas with the same people of their ethnic background. So there were 3 different sections for living. 3 of those were for Jewish people, and then there were 2 others. And so you had then different ethnic backgrounds in those other 2. It was heavily Greek. It was a Hellenized area, and that had to do with Alexander the Great. It was a place where there are so many different philosophies and mystery cults at work, and Clement lived in the midst of it. And Clement, he had his own school which was very common in those days in Alexandria, that, if you had philosophy, or if you were, I should say it like this, if you were a philosopher, then you had your own school, your own philosophical school. And so there were a lot of different philosophical schools in Alexandria, and they lived and died based on the reputation of the philosopher. So the goal was to be a well-thought philosopher that was able to teach and convince, and that would gain you students, and that would increase, of course, the size of your school. It would further the reputation, and it was really, really critical for a philosopher to work to be successful. And Clement himself had his own school, his own philosophical school, and he had inherited that school from another man, a Christian man by the name of Pantaenus. And Pantaenus was, I believe he followed Athenagoras. So there was, if I have my history correct on this, there was Athenagoras who was the teacher of the school. Then it was passed to Pantaenus. And Pantaenus taught Clement, and then Clement took over the school, and then Clement passed it on to Origen. And Origen is well known, and Origen has a mixed history in terms of his place within the church. But within Clement's time, when he was the teacher of the school, of the catechetical school, it was still independent of the church, but he saw his school as connected to the church in a certain way, and so he was always leading people to the church. But with protreptics, Clement himself did not invent protreptic discourse. Protreptic discourse itself came out of the Greek philosophers. So the first known writing on protreptics was by a well-known philosopher you have heard of, and it's one of those things where protreptics was, in fact, let me find my notes here. Aristotle was the philosopher who wrote a treatise on protreptics, and Aristotle really popularized it, I think, within Greek philosophy. He was not the only one to do it, but he was probably the most well-known. And Aristotle's writing on protreptics is no longer in existence. We only have fragments of it, and we have quotations in other writings from it. And so we know that he did it. Clement of Alexandria, for example, in his protreptic writing, will quote Aristotle's protreptics. But protreptic discourse itself aims at the life of the person, and it has a particular thrust in terms of dialogue and discourse. And so when we think about this, let me move on to the next slide here. Here's a little bit more about Clement. He was very experienced in pagan religions. We think that he himself was not born into the church. It wasn't like his parents were Christians and then he was born and baptized as a baby and then, begins. But it seems as though Clement of Alexandria, went through many different religions himself and philosophy. He was very educated. His writing on protreptics has the most quotations from various authors, philosophical writings, cults, you name it. And if my memory serves me, he has over 2,000 different quotations from other sources, the most that anybody was able to have at that time, and even beyond, I think. And so that would lead us to believe that he was highly educated, but that he also had access to the library in Alexandria, because, the common person just wouldn't have had access to all the writings that he's able to quote, which also suggests that he was a man of means and perhaps a man of reputation to be able to have access to the library in Alexandria. When we think about the Alexandrian catechetical school, Clement saw this, and this is a precursor to what I would like to say going forward. He saw instruction and dialogue in three stages. And so we have three writings by Clement. The first one is his protreptic writing. And the second is Pedagogus, which would be his catechesis. It would be a very central approach to moral and doctrinal instruction. And then the third one would be Stromatice, and his Stromatice is a very esoteric writing. It contains a lot of mystery, but it also comes out of his approach comes out of the Stromatice comes out of the approach seen by Aristotle and Socrates, for example, where they would talk about education as going into a garden, and the student goes and sees a flower that he's interested in, and he picks the flower, and he smells it, and he looks at it, and he examines it, and he begins to study it. And then he'll move on to the next thing, and then he'll pick another flower, and he'll begin to look at that and smell it and study it and investigate it. And you sort of make your way. It's sort of it seems like a very miscellaneous sort of approach to learning the mysteries. But that is what Clement did with Stromatice. He takes some of this philosophical thought from the ancients on how to educate, and he puts it into the Stromatice. But the Stromatice is really engaging into the mysteries of the church, the mysteries of doctrine, and you just begin to go deeper and learn everything that you could possibly learn. But with protreptics is what we would call open-ended inquiry. And so there are different parts to this, like deep listening, questioning, walking alongside a person. So it differs from a lot of our modern intellectual dialogue in the sense that it's not just, it's not an exercise where I have my information of truth, you have your information of truth or your precepts, and then we begin to volley back and forth until, one wins the argument. It's this particular approach is a sustained approach. It listens to what the other person believes. I think a lot of times, particularly with modern dialogue, people approach modern dialogue like this. I have my truth, you have your truth, you believe you're right, I know I'm right, as we would say, right? And so then I come from a position of authority or power, and I am trying to get you to see all the weaknesses of your arguments so that you eventually will relinquish your philosophy or your teaching or your truth forms, and then you adopt mine. And so then I win and I bring you over. With protreptics, we walk alongside a person who has a very different philosophy of life from what we have and to which we hold. And we ask questions and we really do listen. So in protreptic dialogue, I would come alongside of, let's say, someone who, well, let's just say a pagan, or, let's just say, or we could say an atheist, okay? Or you could say somebody that adopts a different religion, such as the Sikh religion, for example. And you walk alongside that person and you ask them a lot of questions, and you really want to know what they hold to, and you want to know why they hold to it, and you listen to their arguments. And a big part of what you're doing in this process is you're listening for grains of truth that they hold to, that would be embedded in their philosophy or their religion. And then you try to find a connecting point based on that grain of truth. So the grain of truth would be that, let's say they hold to a grain of truth or something very important and virtuous that is a part of their system of thought, that is good and is true, and it would be a grain of truth to which the Christian faith holds to. And so then what you try to do is you begin to dialogue based on that. So you're trying to find points of agreement, not that you will agree with their philosophy or their religion, but that there is a piece to it that you can agree on. And then the idea is to begin to dig deeper into that. Why is that important for your religion or your philosophy? Why is that important to you? Then you can talk a little bit about why that's important to you, why that particular piece is critical for the Christian faith and the Christian teaching. And there's an idea behind this. And the idea behind it is that you hope to convey to that person at some point that their religion or their philosophy does not, in fact, bear out that truth, that grain of truth to which they hold, or it's ineffectual in bringing it to bear or to bring it to completion, or that there's some inconsistency between the grain of truth to which they hold and how their religion or philosophy would be able to deliver that truth. With the idea then that you will show them or demonstrate to them that only the Christian religion can actually fulfill that truth claim. That's a really important point. So what you have there is, and this comes up often with Clement and the early Christians, was here they are. Clement's, we'll speak about Clement. Here Clement is in Alexandria, Egypt. He's in a very syncretistic, variegated culture with lots of different philosophies, lots of different mystery cults and religions. He simply is wanting to have a seat at the table of ideas. And he has his catechetical school where he invites people in who are outside the church, who hold to different philosophies and religions, and then they begin this dialogue. He's listening to what's important to them and why it's important, but he is ultimately going to try to show them that what they value and view as important will only be found in the Christian religion, only in Christian teaching and doctrine of Jesus Christ. And what he would do then is listen for these grains of truth and then reattach them back to the scriptures. So, one aspect of his perspective, which is found in, interestingly enough, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. He understood that the Christian religion was the correct religion, and that everything else kind of came out of it. And so people would take ideas from Christianity and then they would make their own religion or build their own teaching. And it's funny because even like Clement of Alexandria said that Plato was an Atticized Moses. He said that Plato basically took the core teachings of Moses and then used them. And then what was very interesting is Gregory of Nyssa, one of the Cappadocian fathers, said that that Plato was the like the soup broth merchant for all the other philosophers. And so, he says, he's basically saying, so basically the way they looked at it, the early Christians looked at it was, Plato takes the teachings of Moses from the Old Testament. He uses them in different ways, in his own ways. And then he becomes the soup merchant, the broth merchant that all the other philosophers and teachings then grabbed onto. And so then you have this big splintering, but you have all these different teachings, but you can find grains of truth in these other teachings. And so what Clement's trying to do is go and grasp these other teachings from these other philosophies and religions, and then bring them back to Moses, bring them back to the scriptures, bring them back to Christ, so that the people would then see that the source of what they value is actually found. The completion of what they are seeking is actually found in the Christian religion. And so, in 2 Timothy 3, verse 2, he says that, there will be in those days men who are lovers of themselves. And the Greek word is philautoi. And philautoi is lover of self. But the way Clement interpreted that was, he said that it actually means robbery. A person claims for himself or herself what rightly belongs to God. And so what Clement's goal was in his protreptic discourse in his catechetical school was to do a lot of listening, walking alongside a person. We're trying to reason out truth together. We're on this journey to understand, the cosmos and the deepest things of life. And we want to bring them back to the source. And so you see on this slide, robbery and reorienting truth. That's what Clement tried to do. But he was very gentle about it. And I have this Greek word, this fancy Greek word here, homakaion. So this is a good example of it. So you have the Pythagoreans. And the Pythagoreans were a philosophical school. And, there were a lot of tenets to their faith. And there were Pythagorean schools in Clement's day in Alexandria. And this homokaion is one concept of the Pythagorean teaching and life that they valued. And I want to explain it to you. It's actually a difficult word to find in a Greek lexicon. So it's not an easy find. But what it means is the people that we share a philosophy of life with are the same people that we break bread with. So we gather around a table with them. And that's homokaion. And so a great example of this, Clement's approach would be that he would be interacting with a Pythagorean. And let's say that he starts to talk to them about, tell me some of the important tenet, tell me about an important tenet of your belief, and then, what it means and why. And so here's Clement walking alongside a Pythagorean. He's looking for common ground. And, think about this. This is very different from what we often do in a modern approach to things. In a modern approach to things, we come with our truth and we'll look at a Pythagorean. Here's the tendency, right? To look at a Pythagorean, for example, and say, this guy's crazy. He just can't see, the forest through the trees. And I just need to straighten him out. This often happens in our culture, right? Well, this is not protreptics. Protreptics has a very positivist perspective. Clement had a very positivist perspective. It's a very intellectual approach where Clement liked to listen to ideas. He loved to learn. He loved to listen to what people believed. He was very interested in dialoguing about different teachings. And so he would walk alongside a Pythagorean in this instance, for example, and he would say, tell me about an important tenet of your faith and why that's important. And so then the Pythagorean starts to talk about, well, homokaion. And homokaion is such that, just as I said. And Clement would then say, this is very interesting that you have this belief and that you have this practice, because this we have this too. We hold to this as well. The Christian church gathers together in Alexandria, and we have an altar. And and so then maybe he would say, do you have a table or an altar? And the Pythagorean perhaps would say, yes, we have our own table, and we have our own ritual that we engage in. And so then Clement is talking about this, and he's talking about the ritual within the Christian church in Alexandria. And then eventually what Clement would do is he would, in the discourse, take the Pythagorean back to the book of Exodus and demonstrate how you have an example of this concept of homokaion within Exodus itself. Because and what he could do, for example, is go to Exodus chapter 20. And he would say that, starting in Exodus chapter 20, you have the 10 commandments. The people in Exodus 19, it comes to pass in Exodus 19:16 that on the third day in the morning, there's thunderings, lightnings, and a sound of a trumpet, and all the people in the camp hear. Moses brings the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stand at the foot of the mountain. And so all of God's people gather together at the foot of the mountain. And then what happens, but you begin to have teaching. It starts with the 10 commandments. It comes from God. He recounts the 10 commandments, but then he continues. he continues on for several chapters. So Exodus 20, 21, 22, and 23 are all chapters of the conveyance of God's word to the people at the foot of the mountain. Then you get to chapter 24, and Israel affirms the covenant, and Moses comes, they're at the foot of the mountain, and then the people say, all that the Lord has said we will do and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, he sprinkles it on the people, the blood of the sacrifice. He sprinkles it on the blood, the book of the covenant. And then Moses went up, and also Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, 70 of the elders of Israel. And then it says they saw the God of Israel. And then it says they saw God and they ate and drank. And so what Clement would do in a situation like this is he would find this common ground with a Pythagorean. They'd be talking about this Pythagorean concept of homokaion, and then he would work to demonstrate that this goes back to Moses. And this is really important, right? Because think about human thought and timelines. If in their conversation, the Clement says to the Pythagorean, oh, you have this concept of homokaion, and this comes from Pythagoras. That's wonderful. Jesus has it too. Well, then what's the Pythagorean going to say? He's going to say, well, that's all well and good, but in terms of the earthly timeline, Pythagoras comes before Jesus. And so then the Pythagorean would say that Jesus gets his concept from Pythagoras. Well, but what Clement would do is he would take it back further and demonstrate that it comes from Moses, who is before Pythagoras. And by doing that, then he will begin to talk about the eternal existence of the divinity of Christ, and how Jesus is the Word made flesh, and so Jesus is the author of the scriptures. So then it really all comes from Jesus. And this is how he would demonstrate this. And the goal is to bring the Pythagorean to see that which he holds as valuable, that which he holds as true, as an important tenet to his life and practice and belief, is actually found within Christianity, not Pythagorean philosophy. And there's a lot to this. I think, I'm, kind of watching my time and seeing how my time is slipping away as I dialogue, but, I have more to say and I'll keep going. But, when we think about the the protreptic approach of Clement, he saw that this whole approach was not simply one of intellectual dialogue. It's not just about data. It's not just of the mind, but it is embedded in life, the way one lives. And so I have here on this slide, the Zoe can be manifested only within the Theos. So there's a great little book written by an Eastern Orthodox theologian by the name of John Behr, Behr. And I think he wrote it. It was published in 2000. And he talked, it's asceticism and anthropology in Irenaeus and Clement. And so he really gets into how Irenaeus and Clement understood and conveyed life in the body, right? Concrete, incarnational living. And, it is John Behr himself that says, when he talks about Clement, he says a few things about Clement. He says that if Clement were alive today, he would probably be mislabeled, but he would be labeled as a liberal, because he loved to listen to different ideas. He loved to dialogue with people that differed from him. He loved to learn. He was very gentle. So when he's talking to people who differ from him, he's gonna listen, and he's gonna try to find common ground, but he is not going to betray Christian doctrine. He is not going to betray Christian teaching. He is not going to betray his faith. He's not going to be syncretistic. He is going to aim to draw his hearers back to the Christian faith, because when push came to shove, the one thing that really did irritate Clement was the fact that grains of truth from the scriptures were taken from God, taken from the scriptures, robbed of God, and then philosophers and teachers and religious cults would take those things and claim them to be their own. And they would claim to be the authors of these truths. And so Clement understood, and rightly so, that when truth is pulled apart from the scriptures and away from God and put someplace else, and then, in the technical term, bastardized teachings, then God is not glorified. And so Clement's goal is to find these grains of truth, bring them back along with the person who adheres to these different teachings and philosophies, bring them back to the Christian teaching so that truth is put back in its proper place, so that God is glorified. So it's not just about, claiming truth for truth's sake, but it's to glorify God. It's a very important point. And so John Behr says that with Clement of Alexandria, his gentleness was such that he had his head in heaven, but he tiptoed on the earth. That's a direct quote from John Behr about Clement of Alexandria. So, he was always heavenward in his thinking, walking gently on the earth, teaching, moving, going, trying to persuade, not waffling on what he believes, but holding steadfast. And then this was another quote from Clement, or John Behr, about Clement, that the Zoe can be manifested only within the bios. And what that means is, the word, there's, in Greek, a couple of different words for life. And bios is one form for life, and that would be the biological life. So you're thinking about concrete realities, the physicality of life. But then Zoe is a deeper life. It is used in the Greek New Testament for the spiritual life. And what John Behr is saying of Clement is that the spiritual life, the deeper true life that is gained only through Christ, can be manifested only within the biological. And so this is very incarnational. It is very focused. It's a very anti-Gnostic sort of stressor. It is really emphasizing the fact that to be holy, to be a Christian, to live the life of faith is embodied. And I mean, this is everything that this is a great example of everything that we believe about the incarnation of Christ, and what it is for God to come in the flesh and redeem the world through the cross. And it comes out in various ways. I can give you an example. First of all, here, let me find my place here in the book of Philippians. In the book of Philippians, chapter 2, for example, Paul is talking about Christian humility and the life of the church. And he says, if any consolation in Christ, if there's any comfort of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if there's any compassion and mercy, fulfill my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, having life together with one mind, or one understanding. And in the Greek, there are a few things that are very important here in Philippians 2, verse 1. What happens here in Philippians 2, verse 1 is Paul is talking about the virtues of the Christian or the virtues of the church, but he's using language, adjectives, descriptors that have first been used for God, one of the persons of the Trinity. So if there's any consolation in Christ, paraklesis and in Christo. Paraklesis is the word that we use for the Holy Spirit. Jesus uses it. It's the word for paraclete when we talk about the Holy Spirit, the Holy Paraclete. But then the next word is paramithian, agapes, comfort of love. And this particular word is used for Christ. It is used with a particular emphasis that the Greeks would understand. Paramithian would mean to the Greek-speaking world in the first century, this kind of compassion, it would be to be as physically close to a person who is suffering as is possible. So protreptics comes out along with this. So you're walking alongside a person. You're as physically close to a person in need as possible, whether they realize they're in need or not. But the goal is the physicality. It's to be close. It's to be next to a person. It's, in many ways, like in terms of pastoral care, it's even beyond words. It's beyond the ability to comfort. If someone is going through an incredible amount of grief, sometimes there are no words, but just to be there with a person and to pray with them and to read scripture and to listen. And so paramithian carries this sense. And of course, it's paired with the word agape, which is divine love. That's the love of God as it's described. And there are others, but in the same way, when this verse talks about fellowship of the Spirit, fellowship is koinonia. So that's the gathering of people together around with a commonality. And then if there's any compassion and mercy, compassion is splachna, and this is used for Jesus at different points in the Gospels. At one point, it's within the feeding of the 5,000, where he has compassion, and it's a kind of compassion where his innards hurt, and he feels it deeply. And then the other word for compassion is oiktirmoi, and this is used in Luke 6:36 for the Father, the mercy of the Father. But that too carries with it a certain sense of physicality or location, because oiktirmoi, the root word oik is the word for house. And so the mercy of the Father is such that he is located near to us. Mercy is located near to us. And so the mercy of the Father is in sending his Son. It's a very important point to all of this, particularly when we think about protreptics and discourse. So, I have this slide here on Pedagogus, where we talk a little bit about instruction. And, when we think about instruction, Clement understood that within instruction, Jesus is the only teacher. He's the only didaskalos. And it's very interesting to me because in the ancient world, in the Greek world of philosophy, a paedagogus was a servant who walked the master's children to school. So, Clement himself would never use the word didaskalos or teacher for himself. He would only use the word paedagogus for himself. He was the servant who walked his master's children to school. And so, this was very important. It was a very important point of distinction between Clement and the other philosophical schools, because, in the philosophical world, the philosopher was the end goal, the philosopher of the school. Everything lived and died by the philosopher of the school. But with Clement, he was always leading people to Jesus. He was always leading people to the church. And, I have to think that, what happens after Clement is important because, Clement was the teacher, the philosopher of his catechetical school. Origen follows, but what happens is the bishop of Alexandria in Origen's time merges the catechetical school and the church together, and Origen was not very happy about that. But I have to think that had something to do with the perspective that Clement brought to the catechetical school. So I think this is really important for us to remember as we go through this. And then, of course, as I mentioned, Stromatice, that third writing, you have, it's an esoteric writing. You're learning the mysteries. There's continued growth. He has a literal interpretation of the scriptures, but, there's a sort of miscellaneous approach to his teaching within the Stromatice, but it was for the people who had already been catechized and were considered the faithful and then would be at the Lord's altar. One thing that was interesting about all of this, when you think about his 3 steps to education, he saw education in a very Greek perspective. So he saw that there's an order to what is learned. In Greek education, there is what in Greek is called the encyclia. It needs to be mastered before rhetoric and philosophy. And so the logos, or the word, or the message, provides the model for this when he gives the Old Testament and Greek philosophy as a preparation for the gospel. So the encyclis would be like the rudiments, the basics of instruction, which would then eventually lead to philosophia, or philosophy. After you learn the rudiments of instruction, then you can become a philosopher. And so what Clement does is, he's working in a Greek context. He's in a Greek world, and this is something that everybody knows very well. So he's fashioning his instruction around this. But what he's trying to do is aim at the core of how this is understood, like what comes first. And this too, I mean, this is where, I told Javier that, when we were talking about like how long do I asked Javier, how long do I speak, on this and give this presentation, because I could literally go for days, which is what I do for Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne when I teach continuing education courses. But I also teach a bit of this to the faculty at Concordia University Chicago, as we kind of work our way through. And it's fitting because, within, I talk a lot to our College of Education professors and program leads and the dean and so on and so forth. And, within their pedagogy of education, a lot of what they were taught have the rudiments of Greek paideia. You know, there's talk about the sequence of learning and, you know, the steps of learning. And it's fascinating to me because right off the bat in John's gospel, you know, I think about this. This is a side note, but it's worth talking about. Within John's gospel, New Testament scholars, believe that John wrote his gospel in the 90s AD. You know, there are some differing opinions on that among scholars, particularly one of my doctoral fathers from the seminary in Fort Wayne, whom I love and respect a great deal. He has an early date for John's gospel. But, you know, if we were to hold to a late date for John's gospel, 90s AD, John the evangelist was the only one of the 12 who was not martyred but lived to be an old man. We also know from church history that, you know, St. Paul, and from the scriptures, right, the New Testament, that St. Paul goes up into Asia Minor and he plants churches and does all this work. Well, then in 2 Timothy chapter 1, Paul is about ready to be martyred, and he says, as you know, O Timothy, that all those in Asia have forsaken me. And so what he's saying is that he's getting to the end of his life, and all the work that he had done in Asia Minor, here he is, he's about ready to die, and the people have sort of rejected or moved away from him. But yet church history then tells us, Eusebius, for example, and others, that John the evangelist, living to be an old man, goes into Asia Minor after Paul and continues the work that Paul had started. And so if that is the case, then John is writing his gospel to an audience that is a Greek audience. And it has a lot of Jewish themes in the gospel of John. He has signposts for his gospel that are based around the Jewish feasts. So it has a very Jewish thread to it. But it has a lot of Greek influence and emphasis, I believe. And I want to give you one that connects to Greek paideia. So, you know, we're thinking about Enkyklus and the rudiments of instruction. We're thinking about, steps of learning that leads to philosophy. Well, okay. Plato, he had a very strong understanding of this stuff. And so his approach to the sequence of learning came with a Greek word. The Greek word is akaluthine. To Plato, akaluthine would be the steps to learning. And it would finally lead to, for Plato, what is the realm of ideas. And it is within the realm of ideas that one can become then a philosopher and be enlightened. But you have to go through the akaluthine, or the sequence of steps, or the sequence of learning, to get to that point. And so what we see in John's gospel is, we see in John chapter 1, John the Baptist is standing there, and he has his disciples, and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And then it'll say that his disciples follow Jesus. And this goes on. And then you even get to John chapter 8, verse 12. So you're well into the Gospel of John. And you have this as well. And it says, therefore, again, Jesus was speaking that to them, and he says, "I am the light of the world." And then he refers to those who follow him. "Those who follow me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." So it's thought, and this is my thinking along these lines, is that John's use of the word akaluthine in following is they're learning the sequence of steps which leads to the light of life. And this was something that was just understood in the Greek world. And then in John's gospel, so for John, the sequence of learning doesn't lead to the realm of ideas in quite the same way that Plato would say, but it leads to the cross. It leads to the passion narrative in the Gospel of John. And this is where we begin to learn all of life. And I think this is an important thing to bear in mind when we dialogue with people, because, it's beyond just an intellectualized form of understanding. And we have to be aware of this, as we kind of go through our work, our engagement and our dialogue. And within protreptics, there are four pieces to it. So one is that it is dialogical, so you're dialoguing with another person. There is a sense of discussion back and forth. The second is agonistic or polemical. So there is polemical comes from the word for war, right? So there is just a little bit of bantering back and forth. But again, for Clement, it's good. It's not angry. It's a positive engagement where two people are trying to reason out truth. But there is a sense of agonistic or polemical thread to it. It's also situational. This is very important. The situational aspect is such that there is no set platform for what protreptic dialogue will look like. So often when I go around our church body and teach on this for the seminary or at conferences, people will ask me, can you just give me like the 5 steps to this? And, the whole thing is there are no set steps. It differs. It differs based on the situation. And so what I instruct theologians and clergy and apologists to do in this regard is to read a lot of things. Don't be narrow in your reading. You have to be broad, because you have to know what other people believe. And, you can't just say, because I've heard people say, I've had people in my theological library pick up a book and look at it and say, I disagreed with the premise of this book, so I quit reading it. And my response is, I read a lot of things, and I read things even if I disagree with them, because you got to know what other people believe, what other people think, and why they take a stand on that. So you have to be broad in your reading and your research. And this connects to Concordia University Chicago. I mean, we stand on the truth of the scriptures. We stand on the truth of Jesus Christ. We stand on the Lutheran confessions, as a faithful exposition of the scriptures. And at the same time, we're willing to dialogue with other theories, just so long as everybody's clear on where we stand as a Lutheran university. And so this is a part where protreptic dialogue can come into higher ed and in the academy. And we see this at Concordia Chicago. At the same time, you have to read deeply. To just be on the surface is not going to serve you well, because you have to really get at the heart of the matter. It's not just a matter of knowing a couple of things here and there and having a couple of truth claims. I mean, you really have to understand the foundation of a philosophy or a teaching. I would say the same thing to skeptics of the Christian faith. I think that often, and I will get to this with Javier a little bit more, we have to be careful about what we're dialoguing on. But I will have Javier and I dialogue on that a little bit more later. And so it's really important to understand how we go about dialogue as we engage with people, and think about Greek paideia and what's going on. And that gets to therapia. So another Greek concept that is alive in the Bible, in the Greek New Testament, in the Septuagint. This concept for Clement is closely aligned with the portrayal of the Logos as the trainer of children in Book 1 of the Pedagogus. So Clement conceives of the paideia, or the instruction of the Logos, as a complex system of training. It's, to him, both general and individual. So in the general sense, it is evident of the arrangement of the universe and salvation history. But the Logos also works individually in the lives of the people, instructing each person in the most appropriate way. And so that leads me back to the fourth piece, to protreptic discourse. So I mentioned the first three, and then the fourth one is rhetorical. And so that rhetorical piece, so you have the situational piece, but then you also have the rhetorical piece. And, what you're trying to do is a bit of already pastoral care within the protreptic discourse, even though you're not claiming that, but there's a sense to it, right? There's a therapy of the soul. And let's see if I can find my notes on this. One piece to this that is very important for us is, let's see if I can find it. One piece that's very important for us within the catechetical or the approach of therapia is, you're engaging the whole person. You're not just engaging the mind. And so, there's a very subtle early Christian theme that you can find in patristic writings, but you really have to read deeply to find it. But it fits in with therapia, the therapy of the soul. And it's called the slowness of God. And the slowness of God is such that there are things on the surface that we see and hear from people, and then we want to address what we see on the surface. But therapia is to actually go deeper than that. And so what you're doing is, often what we see and hear in a person, and what we see and hear in their desires and in their loves, whether they're misguided or not, are symptoms of deeper things that lead to that. And so, like Gregory of Nyssa, Cappadocian father from the 4th century, he would talk about virtues and vices. And so he would talk about the slowness of God in this way. He would say that often what we see in a person is on the surface. It would be what we would call deigma in Greek, beating or striking, or, it's the outward manifestation of something. But if you take it one step further and you go a little bit to the interior, then you get to pikra in Greek, which is bitterness or anger. And that can still have an external piece to it, but, you're moving a little further in. But it could also be not just anger, but it could be thymos in Greek. It's sort of the excitement that goes along with something. There's an emotive piece to it. But again, that's symptomatic. So then you have to go a little further in. Okay, so you go a little further into the interior, and then you get to lupe, or grief. And St. Paul talks about lupe or grief in the New Testament as the antithesis to hope. So there's a certain aspect of despair with lupe. There's a certain sense of reservation, or there's a certain sense of you come to a certain conclusion, and that's deeply interior, the grief that a person feels. It's a sense of hopelessness, right? You can't get to a point you need to get to. But even that, there's another sense to this which goes a little further in, and it's fear, or phobos in Greek. And that is very interior, that is very central to what happens. And so often we live by our fears. We make decisions based on our fears. And usually when we make decisions based on our fears, we make mistakes, and we make great mistakes. But then, even beyond that, there's another concept that's even deeper than the fear, and it's even further into the interior in Greek. And Gregory of Nyssa would say that that's enechos in Greek, or guilt. And that's deeply personal. And this is where the guilt is so interior, like we don't let our guilt out to tell another person. We harbor it. And so, so then if you go back the other way and you live with a particular guilt, there's something that has happened in your life. Maybe it's something that has happened to you. Maybe you did it. Maybe it's something that you've concluded based on your life, your circumstances, your generation, right? And then it will ultimately lead to the things that are very visible on an outward way. And that is something that Javier and I need to talk about a little bit when we get to the end of this. But therapia then is an engagement of how do we work with people? And this is very central to protreptics. And this is why protreptics is what it is. This is why protreptics differs from a lot of modern apologetics. This is why we address the life of the person, not just an idea. And so therefore, this protreptic approach, I would say, is deeply intertwined and embedded with the theology of the church and the theology of Christ and the theology of the incarnation. So visual aspects of therapia, according to Clement, one is salvation. And notice, remember I said at the very beginning, there are three pieces to this that I love to protreptics. One is the Greek New Testament, so you've seen a lot of Greek here. Early church, patristics, but then also missiology. Well, here's more Greek. Aspects of therapia: salvation, care, benevolent activity, public worship, and teaching. And so Clement sees this coming from Jesus and from the sacramental life of the church. And so then you think about the pedagogy of Jesus. There's the adaptation of teaching to different types of students, depending on what's going on. Organizing pedagogy in an orderly way so as to aid upward progress of students. Understanding pedagogy as a care of souls, not only intellectual, but also addresses cleansing and reorientation of the whole person. And the use of concealment. Jesus uses parables, secret things entrusted to speech, so on and so forth. And again, and this is so interesting because you see this in the scriptures. You also see this in Aristotelian philosophy. Aristotle, Socrates, they talked about the importance of teaching needed to be oral, not written, so you have this sense of all of this at work as well. And then there's this, and this is something like we could spend a day on this alone, but there's a narrative structure to protreptics. And you see this in the Greek philosophers. You see this with Aristotle. You see this with Plato. Two types of discourse: extradiegetic discourse. Extradiegetic discourse is where I tell you a story, and there are characters in the story, but I am the one trying to persuade you. And there's a place for that. We see this a lot in narratives. We see this in the Bible. We see this in the Gospels. Then there is intradiegetic discourse. And this is for situations where maybe there are power and authority issues within a dialogue. Maybe a person doesn't want to listen to what you have to say or trust what you have to say. Or they see you, like in my case, they would see me as clergy, and they wouldn't want to, if they're outside the church and they are antagonistic to Christianity, they're not going to want to, observe or accept my position as a pastor. And so they're not going to be very open to what I have to say. And so intradiegetic discourse is where I tell you a story. There are characters in the story, but I let a character of the story try to persuade you. So it's not me. I just say, let's look at this together. So this is where a protreptic discourse, you come alongside of a person and you're reasoning things out together. It's two people trying to reason truth and understand the cosmos. And so just within the baptism of Jesus, we can see these two. So when you have the synoptic gospels and their accounts of the baptism of Jesus, those are examples of extradiegetic discourse where the evangelist, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they recount the baptism of Jesus, but they're telling you the story. They're trying to persuade you. They're trying to persuade their audience. But then you get to John's gospel, and here again is, I think, some of the Greek philosophy coming out of John's approach that they would be very aware of, is that John Evangelist, in recounting the baptism of Jesus, lets John the Baptist tell you the story. He lets John the Baptist narrate the account of the baptism of Jesus. It's in John's gospel. And so that's intradiegetic discourse. And it is as though John the Evangelist is saying, hey, all you Greek thinkers, if you don't want to listen to me, listen to John. He saw it. And of course, his first epistle, 1 John, opens up, in a similar way, as he talks about, I've touched Jesus, I've seen him, he's appealing to the evidence that he has. So there's a lot to this, and you're getting kind of just the tip of the iceberg with all of this. And of course, I give you some examples here. There are more that we could talk about. And framing our dialogue, I've talked a little bit about this as well. I could say a lot more. And, this is kind of more of the same of what I've talked about. And kind of, I guess, as I gave this presentation to the English district convention, this is kind of how I ended by talking about the academic pursuit at Concordia University, Chicago, because, we think about this, and this is a very protreptic piece that I'd like to talk about just in a general way, that, I talk about this at the university all the time, that there are three things, in terms of the ethos or the life of a person. And these are Greek also: topos, place; learning, mathesis; and then practice, ascesis. Practice, ascesis, we get the word asceticism from this. And it's the way a person lives. It's the rhythm of their life. It's the way it's what they say, it's what they do. It's the way they go about themselves. And this is often the first thing that we see in a person. And again, that's the external part. But it leads back to what they've learned, the pedagogical framework for life. It's the core teachings of what they've learned that have led to the practice. Well, when you think about learning and the pedagogical framework for life, that has to lead you back to where they learned that teaching, the central place of their learning. And this is where you find the real rhythm of life. And so, what could you say? I know a lot of people that, they don't go to church, but they're very ethical, wonderful people, and they have children and they love their children. And so they have committed to their children being in athletics and sports, which is, athletics and sports. I'm not against athletics or sports. I love sports, but they spend their time on the field every Sunday, every weekend, traveling, and this is the rhythm of their life, and they're learning about how to they learn about teamwork, they learn about moral framework within competition, and working through loss and through victory, and how do you live as a human being. And so, a completely secular person that lives this kind of life would say that the central place of their children's learning would be on the field or on the court. And they learn everything they need to know about life there. Business models are based off of this, and to some degree. But then I would say that for me, for my church and my Christian existence, the rhythm of my life is the altar at the Eucharist, and that's where my pedagogical framework for life is taught to me. And then the Eucharistic life then spins out into the practice and the way that I go about my life. And this is a very important framework for life. It's Greek. It has a patristic basis. And for me, I see it within protreptics, but I see it within everything in life. And it is a basic framework for how people live. And this is important to know as we go forth within our protreptic dialogue, and it's important for our university at Concordia University Chicago, and I think it's important for all of life. And with that, I conclude my presentation on protreptics.
All right, thank you so much for that. I'm looking forward to getting into this Q&A, and then maybe we can talk about sort of application like you're doing there at the end. We can extend that application into today. So, as you mentioned, right, your research is on the patristic period specifically. What do you think the church fathers understood about human nature and persuasion that gets lost when apologetics becomes exclusively a matter of rational argument and sort of like cold, hard facts? Not that there's anything wrong with that. We should have cold, hard facts and rational argument. But I guess, what did the fathers understand about human nature that makes them want to not lead with that necessarily, but, lead with questions of desire and love and this sort of thing?
Yeah. So let me preface the answer to that by just mentioning this. When we look at the early church fathers, there is this sense, right? You have this sort of lineage, right? This family lineage, if you will, in the church, where you have these early teachers like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, and they were living in particular contexts. And then you have the Nicene period, and the Council of Nicaea and so on. The ecumenical councils had to come to terms with certain doctrinal issues that had not been dealt with at the time of Origen or Clement. And so what you have is you have Clement and Origen, and they're living in that world. And then you have Nicaea, and then you have the Cappadocian Fathers. And, the Cappadocian Fathers were Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzen, and Basil the Great. And those three Cappadocian Fathers loved the Alexandrians, and they were heavily influenced by them. The reason why I mention this is they were Nicene theologians, so they recognized, like, Origen had a few hiccups, theological or doctrinal hiccups that they couldn't go along with, after the Council of Nicaea, and but at the same time they were influenced by them. So I preface that by how I would like to answer this, because, like, Gregory of Nyssa, for example, one of the Cappadocian Fathers, was very influenced by Clement, very influenced by Origen, but then he also then takes what he learned, and he's in a Nicene context, and then he continues it from an Orthodox perspective. And so Gregory of Nyssa understood that when you're talking about humanity and you're talking about people and you're talking about arguments, he sees it all couched within the imago Dei, the image of God. For him, the imago Dei is the principal biblical rubric around which he constructs his theory of the soul, and that governs the way he dialogues. So, the soul mirrored divine virtues. He would say that you see in yourself the word and understanding, an imitation of the mind and the word of God, in one form or another. He would say that, preeminent among all virtues is the fact that we're free from necessity. We're not in bondage to natural power. And so, he would say that freedom is a precondition of virtue. He would talk about the beauty of God's nature as contemplated in terms of God's virtue. So this word for virtue is arete, which interestingly enough is used in 2 Peter chapter 1 when it's used in reference to the Eucharist. But arete for virtue, it was used in Homeric culture, and it was referred to the preeminence of the Homeric heroes and their virtues. But then you get to the 4th century BC as Greek city-states, Athens, and it replaced monarchy with a democratic polity. You have Plato and Aristotle who are using arete for virtue to describe a moral and intellectual excellence or virtue that would include prudence, temperance, forbearance, and justice. And so he would see that the cardinal virtues are still evident, and they deeply affect the way one lives, the way one goes about things. And so he would say the highest order of every person would be, in whatever philosophical system, is to aim at being good and doing well. Plato, he wrote what scholars say is his most important writing, the Timaeus, around this kind of concept, what it is to be a human being and what it is to be good. And so Gregory of Nyssa, when he would think about dialoguing with people, and he would look at people that had different philosophies or different perspectives, he didn't see it only as intellectual. He saw that a person's practices are governed by what they believe and what they see as important, and they see their life in society, and that's important. And so you think about we have the theological virtues and the cardinal virtues. And cardinal virtues, cardinal comes from the Latin cardine, which means hinge. And so for these early Christian fathers, they would see that every person, in terms of good and evil, they're living within the hinge of virtue and vice. And so then how does one live? How one lives is governed by what they believe. And so then let's examine what we believe. So then there is some intellectual argument. Intellectual argument was important. These early Christians believed that. If I can just add this, the reason why I mentioned Plato and I mentioned Gregory of Nyssa is because, in reference to your question, Javier, Plato writes what is perhaps his most important work, the Timaeus. Well, what does Gregory of Nyssa do? But he sees the value of Plato's writing, but then he writes a Christianized version of Plato's Timaeus. He orders it in the same way that Plato orders his, and it's on the humanity, it's on what it is to be human, but he frames it differently than Plato does, the human is within an end of himself, so to speak, with Plato. But Gregory of Nyssa sees that humanity is framed within Jesus and what it is for God to take on humanity, what it is for God to redeem the world. And with that in mind, then they would say, let's have an intellectual discussion. Let's have good discourse. Let's contemplate reality. And that's sort of how, and this is very important because, you know, what I'm talking about with Gregory of Nyssa was not unique to Gregory. You see it with Athanasius. You see it with St. Augustine. You see it on and on and on. And then it just continues to move forward into the medieval world.
I'm going to change the order, I think, of a couple of the questions here, based off what you've said. So you said that for Clement, everything, it sounds like, really comes back to Christology, right? And Christ and the incarnate Lord and this sort of thing. And so uh, it's rather striking and beautiful that he would center everything on the incarnate Logos as the one who sings the love of God into human hearts, right? As some people have explained. How does a robust Christology shape the protreptic method, and what happens to evangelism when Christology gets thin?
It's a really good question, Javier. You know, so as you mentioned, Clement of Alexandria in his protreptic writing references the Song of the Sirens, and then he begins to talk about the hymn of Christ, the song of the church. And he's introducing the importance of beauty into our dialogue because, you know, what so often happens is we can get so caught, like Christian apologetics can become very thin if we only look at what I'm trying to accomplish and I'm trying to win the argument, and they're wrong and I'm right, and I have these truth claims, they have theirs, but I see them as wrong. We can become very binary in this approach, or very data centered, right? Where it's just like my point for your point. And we can lose the greater sense of the whole point of the dialogue and what is at the heart of it. Because what really is at the heart of it is drawing people into the truth of Christ, which invites a beautiful life. You know, it's a life that is characterized. I should say it like this. It's a life then that Christology then impacts every other aspect of life. And then it becomes beautiful. So like literature will take on a particular character if we understand the deeper dimensions of what it is for the divine to intersect humanity, right? Like my approach to literature will be different if I see the divine within anthropology. And I would say that's true, right? Like I ride the train into campus every day, and every once in a while I'll see somebody reading a book. And authorship and writing today, popularly speaking, is like, to me, throwaway literature. You know, it's so completely different from the classics. You know, the classics were so often, you know, the great books, you know, and the classics were so often written with a deeper thing in mind. And now today, our authors, you know, they're just writing to get a book done so that they can get their name out there, so that they can make money, so that they can be popular, so that they can contribute to literature. But the literature just, so much of the literature just is flat, you know, and they're not going to stand the test of time. Why? I think to a large degree, it's because the divine and anthropology have not intersected in the lives of so many of the authors. And that's just one example. You know, you can talk about music, you know, you can talk about art. Look at the history of art. And, We can go into Chicago and look at the, our art center there and look at postmodern art. And postmodern art just is so flat to me compared to what has been done in the past. So I could go on and on, Javier, but I think that within one of the things that we have within the early church that I think is valuable for us is they did not live in such a context that we live into today, where today we compartmentalize everything. And well, in a way they kind of did in terms of the Gnostic approach, I guess. There was this diversion, right? There was the spiritual versus the physical. So I guess that was in existence in the patristic period. So in a way, like what we suffer today is similar to the Gnostic approach in the sense that we compartmentalize things. But the early church's perspective on beauty and Christology is to bring to bear the importance of God coming in the flesh, and therefore divinity and anthropology, and that orders everything in a different way, and that therefore will shape our apologetics. And I think that's important.
So, like you mentioned, Clement uses this image of the sirens from Homer, right? This seductive song that's being sung, right, in this old pagan world, and he contrasts that with the song of Christ, right? And so the whole idea seems to be that Clement doesn't just want to argue at people. In a sense, he's almost singing to their soul, right, and to the semblances of the image of God that still remains within them. And so the goal seems to be that he's trying to make the Christian life look irresistibly beautiful. In a media saturated culture where people are bombarded with competing visions of the good life, how do we make the life of Christ genuinely attractive rather than just defensible, which seems to be the sort of goal of a lot of apologetics?
Yeah. It's, I think you have to look at what Jesus is doing. So now you get to not just his incarnation, but why, why the incarnation. And I think, you have to get to the understanding of why does Jesus come in the flesh and what that means for us. Because, and it kind of goes back to what I talked about earlier in my presentation with Philippians 2, that when St. Paul talks about how the church in Philippi should live and characterize itself, it's using adjectives and descriptors that were first used for one of the Trinity, right? And so what you have is, like, you have consolation, love, mercy, compassion, all of these adjectives of the church, of the faith, take on a particular meaning if we understand them within the Trinity, within God. And there is so much to say about this, Javier, because so the humanity, the design of humanity, all the way back to creation and the opening chapters of Genesis, are influenced by the Trinity and the workings of the Trinity. Like in the early church, they had a concept called perichoresis. And perichoresis is like interpenetration in Greek. And we get the word choreography from it. It's two people dancing, and it's back and forth and and they have to be in sync, right? Like if you have a man and a woman dancing together and one has two left feet, so to speak, it's not going to go very well, right? There has to be this certain sense of like they know what they're doing and they're in sync together. And the Trinity has this perichoresis. It's the interpenetration. You have one God, three persons, and within the three persons, there's the interpenetration of how the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit interact with one another, and how how they engage with one another. And so then what does God do? But he creates Adam, and he sees, right? He creates man, he creates Adam, and then what does he say? He says, "Oh, that poor bloke, he doesn't have anybody. He's all alone." And so he causes Adam to fall into a deep sleep, pulls a rib, fashions beautifully the woman Eve, and then what happens is, to another degree, but within the design or the pattern of the Trinity, God likes community, right? You have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, so he creates Adam so that he can interact with his creation in a particular way. Then he creates Eve so that Adam has this interpenetration with Eve, and Eve with Adam. And so what you have then within the design is something that goes beyond just because, right? Or ho hum, here it is. But within the design of the Trinity, we see humanity and we see Adam and Eve. And so then we begin to understand community, right? What it is to engage with one another. And then what you have from this is the importance of the church, right? And so when you think about dialogue and you think about intellectual argument and discourse, and what is it that we are in fact trying to do? Well, we're at the end of it all, we are trying to bring a person back to God, back to Christ, so that they find the why that this happened, right? Jesus came to die for the sins of the world because being born in original sin, we are alone. We are the uber individual. We are an identity unto ourselves, and we are going to die as an individual. We are going to die in our sins. We're going to die alone. And without Christ, it's up to us to make it in this world, and it's going to be really hard. But if we understand all of this through the gospel, the why of the incarnation and the taking on of flesh, and we understand that Jesus dies for the sins of the world and that he comes to bring us back to life, and we get baptized and we're brought into the church, we're brought into the body of Christ, suddenly now there's this deeper meaning and this deeper beauty. And then all the things, all the attributes, all the things that define God begin to define us through Christ, through the church, in holy community. And then this begins to shape everything else that we do, and it begins to define and shape who we are.
And it sounds like what you're saying is, it's almost like in an age where, you see all these philosophies, sometimes even like, you have people saying like, "Oh, I'm going to teach you Stoic philosophy," right? And it's some like, I don't know, 2-minute TikTok, like telling you to be a little bit more serious and to work out a little bit more and not cry as much or something, right? Or you have all these sort of like, "Hey, we're going to offer you guys easy fixes," right? This is going to be the one 5-minute video that's going to give you the new tip and trick that you need for your relationships to look better, or for I don't know, for your back to hurt less, or for your relationships to look a little bit brighter, or whatever. It sounds like from what you're describing that what Christianity is offering and what we have to offer as Christians isn't just another tip and trick. It's not just another 5-minute fix, add to your daily morning routine, but we're offering a totalizing vision, right? This sort of cosmology of why it is that all things exist, the end to which they're all going, and what our role can be in that with the God who created all things and has ordered all those things unto their end. And so in that way, it's very, very different, right, from the sort of little tips and tricks sort of economy that you see for clicks on social media. Is that about accurate?
That is accurate. Yeah. Well said.
So Well, as you mentioned, right? So Clement structures his sort of protreptics around a contrast between false loves and true love. His method assumes that the person you're engaging has disordered loves, things they are already devoted to that are leading them away from God. How do we accurately diagnose the disordered loves of our particular cultural moment? And why is it crucial to get that diagnosis right before we open our mouths to deliver any argument whatsoever?
Yeah, we have to really do a lot of listening, as I've said, to really understand what a person is thinking, what they believe, and why. And, even though it's not spiritual care at that point, it begins to seem a little like that in the sense that, you're listening, as I said, to the symptoms. You're looking for the symptoms, but you're trying to get to the heart of the matter. Like, why does a person, take a stand on what they do? And then, how is it working out for them? Is it something that leads that, ultimately what the disordered loves, what you're trying to get to is you want them to see like what they desire in life, uh, what's virtuous, what are the loves that they seek, why do they seek them, but then ultimately, does their teaching will their teaching and their philosophy get them there? And so often what you find is it just, if you can logically sort of take it back and through dialogue with people to help them to see like what they're seeking in society, or what they're seeking, like let's say they want love or justice in the world, is how they're going about it and their truth claims, are those actually going to get them the justice that they think is needed in the world? Or to put it another way, do they think the world is good? And how's that playing out for you? Like when you see how people behave, is there a righteousness, an overarching righteousness that governs people's lives? Or do people pretty much just retreat back to their vices when push comes to shove? And so then it's a dog eat dog world. Um, I love Augustine. He talked about this concept of privatio boni, the privation of good. And then I think Martin Chemnitz, one of our Lutheran forefathers from the Reformation, also talked about privatio boni. It's the privation of good. And so it's like the highest good, right? But what they did was they kind of did like a stair step. And so they would say like the highest good, or the most pure love, would be like one of God's commandments, So you could take like, stealing. Okay, thou shalt not steal. Okay, so that's the highest good, right? That's the best point to be. But then one step down would be um, changing that just a little bit. So instead of stealing, what if I take something in a dishonest way that seems to be uh, okay, right? Like if I employ a dishonest or a terrible tax, a ridiculous tax on somebody to get more of their money, but I'm claiming there's a right reason for it. That's the lesser good, but it's one step down from the highest love, right? And then you could go one more down and you could talk about coercion. Like I could bribe somebody and say, you have to give me this or else I'm going to ruin your reputation. Well, that's one more step down. Then one more step down would be just pure theft, right? I just go in and steal something from somebody. But each step is like a privation of good. And with each privation of good is going to come, of course, vice, but then also consequence, but then also the destruction of the soul. And the destruction of the soul is slower the higher up you are, but what ends up happening is a movement to darkness. But if we stay up and stay with what the Lord teaches, whatever the teaching is, then our loves begin to be ordered. But you have to understand, part of the reorienting of loves is through dialogue, to help people to see why God's teaching is the way that it is. Like, what are the benefits and the positive attributes of adhering to God's teaching, like reorienting God's love. And if we understand God's teaching within his ordering of loves, then we are back to that concept of beauty. Truth and beauty go together. And then also we see hope and joy and all the other wonderful attributes of a life of faith.
The protreptic method requires that the evangelist actually knows and engages the culture that he's addressing. As you mentioned, Clement himself was deeply immersed in Greek literature and philosophy. What does that demand on the apologist look like today? And how do we avoid either ignoring culture or being absorbed by it?
Such a good question. It's so hard today because we live, our lives are so embedded in our culture today. And with social media, we just can't get away from it. And, and it's really unfortunate because so much of our technology puts right in our faces other cultural norms that in some cases are just horrific. And so for us, we have to be very careful that we engage. We have to be careful who we engage and what we engage. So in other words, we want to read. It's important to read what other people think, but we want to do it in a constructive way so that we actually understand the experts, for example, not just the pop culture of things, because lots of times the pop culture is just on the surface and there's no rhyme or reason to it. It just is. And I think it's important to understand the arguments. And this is where we connect with some more modern apologetics. Like, it's good to read the experts in other fields to understand what they believe. And it'll help us then to craft our thought a little more thoughtfully, I think that's really important for us to do today. I think that for me, I'm a sacramental Christian, so my life is centered around the Eucharist, right? Place, learning, practice. So, I everything that I read and reflect on is within the framework of Christ's body and blood in the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, as I reflect on him and his teachings, as I listen to the scriptures. And everything that I read is framed within Christ and his scriptures and the Eucharist. And so I say my prayers, I go to the Eucharist, I kneel, Christ feeds me with his body and blood, and then I seek his wisdom and his divine protection as I engage. And I keep my eyes fixed on Jesus so as not to be absorbed by secular culture and the world, but that it's all framed within Christ and his teachings.
And I think that's very important too. There's a this gets used in sermon analogies all over the place, but this idea that the person who's an expert in tracking down false currencies in the government or whatever, right? These sorts of individuals, sure, they might have, let's say, famous tells of fake bills and stuff that they might have knowledge of at their disposal, but the main thing is that they actually need to know the real thing really, really, really well. Right. And so if they know the real thing really, really, really well, it's going to be really hard for them to be swept up by even a very clever sort of fake bill. Right. And just a
Hmm.
similar thing for us, where if we know our doctrine really well, if we know, for us as Lutherans, right, we know the scriptures and also our confessional documents really, really well. We know how to explain it. Like if someone, it happens even for me, right? Where like I love reading and I have this issue where if I don't sit down and conscientiously be like, okay, let me try to explain to somebody that has no kind of knowledge whatsoever on this topic, what I just learned. If I don't sit down and do that, then it's very easy for me to know, like, well, I understood the topic, but could I actually explain it? It's very easy for me to fall into the trap of not being able to explain it to somebody. And so I think if we, uh, spend a significant amount of time immersing ourselves in the scriptures, talking about the scriptures, encouraging one another, as the scriptures say, right, with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, and this is just what we're always doing, and we know our doctrine really well, then to your point, we can engage with the culture without suddenly being swept up by all their errors, right?
Hmm.
But it's kind of hard for us to engage with the culture as we always are with social media and with people at our workplace and so on and so forth. And then if we do that first and then try to play catch up with always trying to patch up the holes that are being poked in our worldview, that's never going to work.
Right.
Right. And so we need to make sure that that's taken care of first.
Hmm.
Um, Now, my next question for you is Clement presents himself as a model, someone who has himself been transformed by the love of Christ and is now overflowing with philanthropia or love for mankind. That suggests that the messenger is inseparable from the message. How does the personal holiness and genuine love of the apologist factor into the persuasive power of the protreptic appeal?
It's absolutely critical. Within the approach of protreptics, I mentioned the logos, the pathos, and the ethos. And the ethos is the moral conduct of the speaker. These are the three things that are necessary for a person to engage in protreptic discourse. And it's it's seen throughout. It's seen within Christ himself, within the Gospels, and within the Sermon on the Mount. These things are at work within him and his life and his ministry within the Gospels. And this is just not mine, but this is brought up very gently by a theologian who once was a Missouri Synod Lutheran who became Eastern Orthodox, Yaroslav Pelikan, who also taught, I think, at Yale divinity. Yaroslav Pelikan wrote a little primer on the Sermon on the Mount where he addresses the three commentaries on the Sermon on the Mount, that of Augustine, that of John Chrysostom, and that of Martin Luther. And he frames his book around these three things: the Word, the Logos, the pathos, the message, or the emotive response, and then the ethos, the moral conduct of the speaker. And he sees it first within Jesus, and so then this becomes the pattern of the church.
Hmm. It's interesting for me to think about because you have some apologists, like for example, people that I would say have a very godly demeanor online. People like a friend of the channel, Dr. Gavin Ortland, right? He's a Reformed Baptist, but Gavin on the Baptist side, there's even people like also a friend of my channel, Sean Luke, who's an Anglican, and we have Lutheran voices as well. You can think of Pastor Brian Wolfmueller and others who have this sort of godly conduct on the internet. But it's also very common to see on the internet, shall we say, less than godly conduct, right? And people will, it's not just a matter of being direct, right? Because you can be direct without being a jerk to people, right? But a lot, I don't know. I think social media incentivizes us to have the hot take, to have the zinger, to have the sort of last word that you get over somebody. You see a lot of Christians, for example, that go out of their way to, with very harsh language and this cursing and this sort of thing, just
Mhm.
mocking and demeaning unbelievers. And then when you kind of point this out, like, hey, hold on a second, should we be doing that? Like, why are you doing that? Right? You'll often hear this response of, well, Elijah mocked the prophets of Baal, right? And Jesus calls the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. And so this almost gets used as a way to just completely deflect any kind of critique of the way of how we conduct ourselves on the internet. I'm curious, what would you make of those sorts of I'll call them excuses, but but you can call them counter arguments they offer. What would you make of those?
I think it's unfortunate to see people behave in those ways, and I've heard that too, where they cite Jesus overturning the tables, or, things of that nature, or Elijah. But, I think for us, like, we rest within the new creation of Christ. And I think it's really important for us to understand what the scriptures teach on this stuff. And we have to dig deeply. We have to be very reflective. I think we have to be very honest about who we are and what we're capable of as sinful human beings as well. Like, for example, to dig into the scriptures to see how to behave, I think we have to look at such things like Jesus in the Beatitudes. He says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And the word meek in Greek is praus, or prautes. And it's very interesting because in, I think, Numbers 12, verse 3, we're told why God uses Moses. And it says that Moses was the meekest man on the earth. And in the Septuagint, the word is praus. And but then you have to understand, like, what that word means. And so, like, in English, in our culture, whenever I ask people, what does meek mean to our culture today, our secular culture today, people would say it means weak. Meek is weak. But Jesus is teaching us to be meek in the Beatitudes. He's teaching the disciples. So what does meek mean? What does praus mean? Praus means that when something happens, you take a step back, and through all of your learning, all of your studies, all that the Lord has taught you, all of your catechesis, all the wisdom that the Lord has instructed you through his word and through your life at the Eucharist, you take a step back and you look at the situation at hand. And then you look at the people involved and what's behind it. And you take what you've learned, and then you wisely engage given the situation. It's a very reflective, contemplative engagement filled with godly wisdom. It's a very comprehensive perspective. And what's very interesting about this is there are two places in the book of Proverbs that talk about, it says something to the effect of, they read just slightly differently, but it says something to the effect of, the godly see danger and they hide themselves, but the simple pass on and are punished for it. And this is the concept of praus, of meekness. And what it is like something happens, and instead of like just diving in and then getting mowed over, the wise person steps back for a second and watches it all happen, and then contemplates, and through the things of God then goes forward. And it's a different way of looking at things. And what's so interesting is, I believe in the Septuagint, the word that's used in those verses is the word for meekness, praus. And so I think that I think it is easy sometimes for us as Christians to have kind of a divine righteousness or a justified righteousness. But I think it's really important to lean into the teachings of Jesus, where we are to remember who we are, that we too need the grace of Christ, and we need his mercy, and that we are just as liable to fall, and to fall hard in the midst of our own sins and our own temptations. And so I think a perspective that always has one's eyes fixed on Jesus will help.
And there's a lot of warnings in scripture about pride, right? And being haughty. And I mean, there's nothing like indignation and nothing like acting quickly and speaking off the cuff that will lend itself to pride and haughtiness and to a fall. It's interesting for me because again, Jesus does call the Pharisees whitewashed tombs, but he's also the God man, and the scriptures say that he didn't need anyone to testify what's in man because he already knew what's in man. All right, and so last time I checked, as it turns out, unfortunately, I can't read hearts, right? And especially on the internet, I think it's very easy. I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been my last sort of holdout on social media right now is like YouTube because of the channel and Twitter, which even that I'm trying to be on way less.
Mhm.
But it's it's um it's very easy to look at other people as not people, right, on the internet. And obviously, there's bots out there, and I've talked about that before. But even when they're actually real life, flesh and blood people, I think we can very easily just see them as a bunch of text on a screen. And because we don't know them in real life, where they're not standing in front of us, that we feel a lot more comfortable mistreating them and speaking to them in ways that we shouldn't. Because again, unfortunately, social media is very disembodied, which goes kind of against the the sort of approach
True.
that we've been talking about.
That's right.
Whereas if I know someone, I run into them all the time, I'm in the same space as them, perhaps I know their family and their friends, that's going to change the way that I approach them.
Mhm.
Um, and so, to your point, I think it is wise for us to take a step back, to be meek insofar as having power under control. Sure, there's all sorts of mean things that I could say, or there's all sorts of demeaning language I could employ, but I'm going to keep them under control and figure out what is even happening. And I do think there are times, right? There are definitely times for, uh, uh, you know, uh, as the scriptures tell us in Proverbs, right, that we should not respond to a fool according to his foolishness,
Mhm.
but there's also a time to respond to the fool according to his foolishness, right? But that's a matter of discernment. And so it's interesting for me because I think of the people that say, oh, well, Elijah mocks the prophets of Baal. And it's like, yeah, but guess what? That's because the prophets of Baal were bad faith demonic actors set on attacking Elijah. They didn't even care, right? That their sacrifice failed. Presumably, if Elijah didn't mock them and later on have them executed, they would have kept doing their own thing anyway. But if you
Mhm.
look at the way that Elijah deals with, let's say, the widow that he deals with and her son, right? Even though they're not Jews, even though presumably, right? Who knows what they've ever even heard about God correctly, and yet he deals with them very gently. He does miracles in their presence and this sort of thing. And so I think it's also a matter of knowing our audience, right? And knowing who it is that we're even dealing with. Because sometimes I think someone comments in good faith on social media, and
Mhm.
because our social media is kind of engineered to make us angry all the time, we assume that every single one of these people is like a prophet of Baal, when in reality there could be a widow, right? In that sense, right? There could be someone who is like a broken sinner coming to Jesus instead of a Pharisee, but we don't know that because we just jump at the chance to attack them.
Mhm.
And anyway, yeah. I'll
That's
get off
true.
my soapbox there, but I think there's we got to handle different people differently, and I think we lose sight of that on social media.
Yeah, I agree with you completely.
So, well, I'll ask one final question on social media, and then I'll ask you one question after that, and we'll wrap this up. So, social media has given every Christian a platform, but it's also made most public discourse, like I just mentioned, adversarial and highly performative. It's being done for other people. Is the protreptic method even possible in that environment? Does it require a different kind of relational context to work, or is there still a way to make it work in that environment?
I think it's really hard. It's a disembodied form of dialogue. It's um, it's also one, and again, I'll quote like Aristotle on this, that he said that this is Aristotle, right? So conversation is um, based on a particular setting. I'm using my own words to say what Aristotle said, but it's got its own perspective, right? And Aristotle said that everything should be done orally because it's contextual. Because, if you say something, if you're dialoguing with someone, they can question you and you can correct it or clarify, and there's this organic sort of back and forth. But when you're doing it, when you're writing it down according to Aristotle, it's outside of context. And so then your words can be misinterpreted, misconstrued, and it hinders a relational aspect in the natural order of conversation. And it can, in fact, then become very destructive to be done
just on paper. And it's or on screen. And it's hard because we love to write. I love to write. I love to write down my thoughts, but I think it's best when you think about the church, you think about Christ, you think about the incarnation, you think about divinity connecting to anthropology, and it's natural that we should be speaking with one another, particularly on these important topics.
What is one final practical takeaway from the patristic approach to apologetics that the average person should employ in his or her evangelistic efforts today?
It's a really good question. I think that in our culture today, it goes back to what I've said before. I think that, boy, it is so hard, right? It's so hard to like nail down one thing. I think that listening is critical. I think that we don't listen enough. But I would add to that it's listening with an understanding that each person we listen to is a creation of God, that they are people with souls. And I think that it's important to recognize, and I did not say this, but I think it's important because as Christians, we do not want to waver from the truth. It's okay to just listen and not like straighten a person out right away. Like if you can listen and not respond or correct them right away without sinning. I think with Christians, we fear that like if somebody tells us something crazy that they believe in and we don't straighten them out right off the bat, then our consciences are crushed and we feel like we've been unfaithful to the Lord. And it's okay to listen and not respond yet, knowing that you're at some point going to share the truth with them. Because I am like Clement, I'm going to stay with the truth of Christ and the truth of the scriptures and our Lutheran teaching, and I am not going to waver. But it's good to just listen and know that you can come back to this another time and pray to God that the Lord will give you the opportunity to share the truth. But I think that a lot of times we fear in our listening that we're sinning by not straightening them out right on the spot. And that's not to compromise the truth. It's just to kind of say, I don't know that they're ready for this yet. And I'm gonna share the truth when I have a chance. I think that's just a dynamic that's always at work within the realm of listening. And I think
I was gonna say as well, I think one of the things that, well, it would be great if every apologetics conversation ended up with the person we're talking to on their knees, calling out to God, right, for for salvation. Well, that would be great. That's just not realistic, and it's not what happens most of the time. And so I think, to your point, we can overburden ourselves with like that's the goal every single time. Where actually, what if the goal is instead, as I believe it's Greg Kuchel, I think, has said, what if the goal is just to put a pebble in their shoe? Right? To say this one thing that kind of gets stuck around in their head that the Holy Spirit uses to convict them, where they're like, man, let me go back to that. What's that idea that you explained, or what's that thing that you said, or maybe you mentioned one thing that was a little bit of an objection to something that I believe, and I've just been thinking about it. I can't get it out of my head, right? And then that leads to further conversations. But if we just want every single conversation to be a slam dunk every single time, like they're gonna come out of there like they've just gone through seminary or something, right? Like we're gonna straighten everything out, then we're just going to scare the person off. They're probably going to be very closed off versus, like you've said, if we listen, we lead with love and beauty, and we just want to leave a pebble in their shoe to hopefully lead them to a place where we can have those larger conversations. That seems like a much uh, better and more easily attainable goal,
Yes.
right?
Yep. I like
So,
that.
in any case, well, thank you so much, Dr. Kendall, for joining us once again. Maybe we can have you back on at some point to discuss this sort of thing further. I'd love to make that happen. Is there anything else that you'd like to say or shout out before we head out?
Yeah, I would just like to thank you, Javier, for the opportunity to come on to your podcast and talk about these things. These are near and dear to my work, as a pastor and as a theologian. And, and I do see it in so many ways. I just want to give one last shout out to our university, Concordia University, Chicago, and all the work that we're doing, because so much of what I have talked about here is a great example of our faithfulness at Concordia, because we have so many students that are not Lutheran, and we have many students that are outside of the faith or outside of the church but want a good education. And we are a faithful Lutheran university, and we are committed to being faithfully Lutheran with a Christian mission. And we are going to continue to go forth in truth with Christ at the center. We are going to continue to uphold truth, freedom, and vocation at the university. And we want to do so in a way that is one of integrity, where people know, students know where we stand and who we are, and that they can get a good Christian education where they are well prepared for their profession and prepared for their major, so that they can go out into the world and truly consider the higher things and serve the common good, and perhaps maybe even in their lives give glory to God.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kendall. Hopefully we'll see you again on the channel, and we'll see you later.
Okay, thank you so much, Javier.